Any explanation of the automotive sales industry in the US is best served by acknowledging the inception of the automobile itself. But this is no easy task. There's no one definitive moment in history where a single brilliant inventor walked into a proverbial garage with tools, metal, and gasoline, and emerged with grease all over his face wearing coveralls proclaiming, "I have something the world has never seen." While many credit Carl Benz, or even Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler as the pioneers of the first automobile at the end of the 19th century, credit should also be given to Frenchman Nicolas Joseph Cugnot, whose steam-powered road vehicle was the first of its kind in 1769, or Nicolas Otto for inventing the first effective gas motor engine in 1861. Though the popular credit given to Carl Benz is not misplaced, as he earned the first patent for the automobile in Germany in 1886. In the same year, fellow German Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler, with the help of Wilhelm Maybach, built his own version of the automobile. Had they tried to race each other, the winner would have scorched the loser at a fireball speed of approximately 8 miles per hour. Soon after the first automobiles were doing donuts in Germany, the US experienced its own inception of the automobile. As was the case in Europe, the beginning of the car industry in the US cannot be credited to one individual either. Before Henry Ford built his first automobile in 1896, bicycle makers Charles and Frank Duryea tested a gas-powered car in 1893. They went on to set up what is widely considered the first business aimed at commercially selling automobiles. Of course, Ransom E. Olds, Elwood Haynes, Hiram Percy Maxim, and Charles Brady King should not be neglected either. Elwood Haynes road-tested a car in Indiana in 1894, but no more than a couple of miles into his maiden voyage, a policeman, on a bike, pulled him over. Elwood proceeded to receive what many historians jokingly consider the first speeding ticket, which was undoubtedly followed up with the first line of excuses given to a cop through a driver's side window. And though Hiram Percy Maxim's gas-powered car built in 1895 was just as impressive as Haynes and his historical joyride, the stroke of genius that followed for Hiram was even more impressive, though possibly only in hindsight. You see, Hiram designed an electronic automobile, and Ransom E. Olds built a steam-powered car in 1887, almost a decade before his gasoline-powered car launched his career. Little did they know they were ahead of the green movement by more than a century. They might even be the first hipsters. Who knows? Olds would certainly make a name for himself as a manufacturer. But what kept men like the Duryea brothers from reaching the historical fame earned by guys like Henry Ford? Well, for starters, Ford built and sold several early models of his car to finance his attempts to improve what he'd already built. This pursuit of perfection, along with his interests in race testing his cars, ruined some early business partners. As a result, the Henry Ford Company split ways with the man that gave them their name and formed the Cadillac Motor Company. Henry regrouped and formed the Ford Motor Company. But Ford would need more than a great car to make his new company exponentially profitable. After all, the first Model Ts took approximately 728 minutes to make. This drove up the cost of production, making the car less affordable. The price point was a hard pill to swallow for a man determined to bring the automobile to the masses. Ford's victory in court against George Selden's automobile patent eliminated royalty costs for early manufacturers, but he'd still need to lower his prices, and to do that, he'd need to make more cars in less time. Out of this necessity, the assembly line was born. Ford cut his production time from a single Model T from 728 minutes to just over 93 minutes. As a result, Ford Motor Company flourished, more cars were made, prices were lowered, and more cars were sold. Of course, as is the way of capitalism, his colossal rise was met with inevitable competition. In 1908, William Durant spent a whopping $2,000 to incorporate General Motors in New Jersey. By 1915, his Buick was the strongest car in his line. Much of Buick's success can be attributed to a man named Walter P. Chrysler, who brought the same assembly line approach to manufacturing Buicks. Durant would eventually appoint Chrysler as the president of Buick after his leadership tripled Buick production and created one of the strongest car names in the market. Around the same time, Ransom Eli Olds was enjoying his own level of success as vice president of Olds Motor Works. Although Olds is a major name in the establishment of the U.S. car industry, it was a pair of mechanics, brothers, that ran Olds' machine shop for several years who made equally significant contributions to the brand's success. As a result, when a 10% stake in Henry Ford's up-and-coming Ford Motor Company was offered to these men, they took the risk, and it paid off in millions of dollars in profit. With this newfound wealth, the Dodge brothers eventually branched off and started their own company, building and selling their Dodge automobiles. Eventually, they sold their company to Chrysler, who by this time had split with Durant and Buick. All of these three developments culminated in forming what we now know as the Big Three. Ford, GM, and Chrysler became the three pillars of the American automotive industry and remain the three largest domestic manufacturers to this day. One of the first major challenges for the Big Three came with the onset of World War II. From 1943 to 1945, commercial manufacturing turned to war production and no doubt helped fuel a victory for America. Post-World War II, the U.S. enjoyed an economic boom. Soldiers returning with their hard-earned military wages helped fuel consumer demands for cars, and after a 3-year hiatus, commercial manufacturing resumed. Demand outweighed supply and the car industry was back on track. There's an old saying, bad habits are created during good times, and good habits are created during bad times. This was certainly true during the car boom that followed the end of the war. For the car industry, bad pricing habits developed very quickly. Dealers were free to price gouge their way into recouping any losses sustained during their break in production. Consumers suffered the most, with some dealerships selling cars to the highest bidder. No doubt these business practices influenced poor industry stereotypes until 1958, when Senator Elmer Stilwell Mulroney introduced a bill to the Senate that required dealerships to place a sticker on their cars that clearly communicated the manufacturer's suggested retail price and include a list of specifications for every vehicle. And thus, the Mulroney sticker was born. This marked arguably the most significant development in how cars are sold all over the world and is one of the first regulations geared towards consumer protection in the auto industry. Even with the regulation of pricing, the car business continued to flourish through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. And while automobile costs steadily rose, affordable financing options kept cars within reach for the average consumer. In addition to better payment plans, consumers were also presented with more model options. The presence of foreign car companies grew during this time. Among the more notable successes were the Renault Dauphin and the Volkswagen Beetle, which fought for import popularity through the end of the 50s and beyond, though the Beetle arguably won that battle in the long term. Needless to say, these international automobiles added more choices to a strong American market. This increased selection only strengthened the need for great salesmanship. International competition and fuel costs put a lot of financial pressure on dealers. They had to push harder to sell more cars and turn higher profits. And slowly, the industry began to push the idea of leasing, a practice that can be traced back to Sumeria in approximately 2000 BC. Initially, most consumers resisted. After all, people were taught to buy high-quality products that'll last for a long time. The idea of leasing sounded a lot like renting, and that made customers feel like they were throwing money away as opposed to investing it in a purchase. Of course, the car industry wasn't all smiles during the 2.5 decades of growth that followed World War II. It certainly fluctuated, like any major commercial commodity might. The most significant threat came in the early 70s. Rising cost of gasoline inflated the cost of production, and those increases were passed on to the customers. To offset production costs, American companies cut back on their number of models. However, foreign companies were continuing to gain a stronghold in the American market. By the early 80s, Honda and Toyota would begin strengthening their U.S. presence. But with new technology and the demand of higher safety regulations, the cost of manufacturing continued to increase and car prices steadily went up. Budgeting for a car was becoming more difficult with rising MSRPs, so dealers pushed leasing even harder in the 80s. Here's why. Historically, most consumers bought a car and looked to trade for a newer one after 5 years or so. This is currently referred to as the buying cycle. But when cars ran out of warranty, didn't perform like new, and new models aroused interest, a lot of people preferred to trade out sooner than 5 years. And a way to do that without paying an arm and a leg for a new car, not to mention incurring a cost of trading out of their old one, more people opened up to the concept of leasing. Since consumers pay on a portion of the car they use when leasing, the corresponding payments and down payments tend to be much lower than buying the same car. Plus, owners got to trade out before their warranties ran out. This cut the buying cycle almost in half, so consumers enjoyed new cars, dealers sold more cars, and manufacturers increased production. Not to mention, it opened a channel for slightly pre-owned, quality cars for those who didn't or couldn't buy the new ones. A win-win situation for everyone. Dealers pushed this idea of leasing through the 80s, and when the first big wave of computer technologies hit in the 90s, The domino effect on car prices and consumer buying trends, as mentioned before, fueled the popularity of leasing. This lower cost of driving helped many get into new cars that they normally wouldn't afford and opened a huge door for more luxury car buyers. However, the most recent changes to the auto industry is likely the most significant: the internet. And the role it's played in consumer marketplaces continues to shape how consumers buy and dealers sell. When the internet began to expand in the mid to late 90s, dealers were hesitant to harness it as a utility for selling. Soon afterward, dealerships had to embrace the internet or give in, though a few decided to duke it out and eventually lost the battle. Business began to shift toward utilizing the online shopping experience. By the early 2000s, dealers were allocating the necessary resources and turning their websites into an online brochure. A decade later, internet departments were a continuously growing channel of dealership sales and service. Thus, websites evolved from simply a brochure to an online dealership. The internet also changed the dealer-customer dynamic. In fact, it turned it on its head. Before the technology boom, consumers had an easy time selecting the car they wanted, but hit a wall when trying to get numbers from local dealers. Today, numbers are the easy part. All pertinent information is online, and dealers are willing to quote figures up front. But selecting the right car has become a much harder decision for buyers with so many options available. Cars no longer fall into the three basic categories of sedan, sports car, and truck. Now you've got crossovers, hybrids, SUVs, and wagons. Soccer moms are opting for stylish SUVs. Sedan drivers who want a sporty feel are finding solace in a four-door coupe, a responsible compromise for anyone in a midlife crisis. And as technology provides more advanced features, consumers are considering a wider range of options beyond vehicle styling. Selecting the right car in many cases is incredibly complicated and often outweighs money as the priority in the decision-making process. The stock market and real estate industry helped the economic boom of the early to mid-2000s and reflected heavily with car transactions as manufacturers and dealers posted some of the highest sales to date. But the pendulum swung hard in the late 2000s when the housing market crashed and the financial struggles were mirrored in the auto industry. 2008 and 2009 dealt fatal blows to some dealers who couldn't hang on in the face of the economic tsunami. For those who stayed in the business and the few who actually grew, the solution was clear: trim expenses. Unfortunately, it resulted in a lot of layoffs. The remaining staff, fortunate enough to keep their jobs, took on more responsibilities, and three-man jobs were being done by two people. Many credit controversial and drastic measures like the Cash for Clunkers program and the following bailouts as critical moments that saved the industry from complete collapse. Others credit the resolve of hardworking dealers who were committed to succeed regardless of condition or circumstance. Currently, the American car industry is slowly yet surely returning to form. The industry is once again finding stability by strengthening focus on production quality and green standards such as emissions and gas mileage. So where's the car business headed? Soon, with baby boomers retiring, Gen X and Gen Y will take over as the largest consumer market for the auto industry. And we're left to wonder and theorize about how the car buying experience will change. According to some controversial consumer advocacy programs, the salesperson will soon be a thing of the past, and cars will become just like any other online commodity. But is that really the potential future for dealers and consumers? Should consumers buy cars online like any other commodity and bypass the value of a first-hand buying experience? Day-to-day driving is a big part of the American way of life. This experience for many is directly tied to their lifestyle or even their level of happiness. But this commodity can't be treated like other products, like clothing or electronics. If a buyer is unhappy with a purchase, it's not a simple, hassle-free, costless process. There are drawbacks to buying a car sight unseen that could end up costing you money. The advantages of a first-hand, visceral experience of buying a car still outweighs the convenience of online shopping, especially when the decision is largely about how you feel in the car. That's not to say that technological advances in shopping for a car can't help the consumer process, but to remove the salesperson from the process completely is to rob the buyer of a crucial element in shopping for a car. So it's important for the modern salesperson to use technology to their sales advantage. Technological advances are happening at an exponential rate, and working professionals are trying hard to keep up. From the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world to a farmer operating a GPS-guided harvester, mankind is racing to keep pace with advancements in technology. And as technology reinvents how we do things and the car world evolves, the one constant element that'll never go away, yet must reinvent itself, is the human element. Which brings us back to the salesperson. At a time when savvy consumers can easily access pricing, peer recommendations, and referrals, salespeople must make sure their customer service skills are running on all cylinders. Salespeople need to reinvent themselves as better consultants, guides, and consumer advocates. The moment when the average consumer realizes that buying a car from a salesperson at a dealership is a unique and superior experience to simply online shopping is not a moment for dealers to hope for. It's a consumer mindset that must be earned. The future of the car salesperson is the evolution into the car sales consultant, a role no computer can play. No matter how far technology expands the way cars are sold, the only constant factor that trumps a growing disconnect in an exponentially expanding technological era is the human element.